Hello everyone, and welcome to Decades. In today's adventure, we have returned to the mighty city of York, and this time we're arriving via a boat that we borrowed, and by borrowed I mean commandeered, and by commandeered I mean stole. However, we of course paid money for the privilege and returned it, so I think we've escaped consequences for our actions this time. The lapse in judgment on the part of the boat people aside, I think it's fair to say that York is a treasure trove for anybody interested in any way whatsoever in history. Around every turn it is positively dripping with it. And roadworks, apparently. But that's unsurprising for a city with almost 2 millennia worth of stories. And I am of course talking about the history, not the roadworks. Those are unsurprising, but for reasons of their own. Anyway, simply put, when it comes to the annals, York doesn't lack. This cathedral city has seen it all: Romans, Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, Normans, and in more modern times, Americans. This beautiful city has remained ever relevant throughout the ages, but in today's video there's one place within York in particular that I wish to explore the history of. This is Clifford's Tower, and no, before you ask, to my knowledge it is not named after a big red dog. But what it is a castle, or at least the remnants of one, with a story that naturally spans across hundreds of years. The ruinous keep of what's known today as Clifford's Tower stands on the site of what was once a wooden Norman motte and bailey fortress, constructed under the instruction of William the Conqueror following his invasion of England during his northern conquests around the year 1068. In order to dominate the important Viking city of Jorvik, one of York's many historical names. The castle constructed here would have been a very basic motte and bailey setup with a 200-foot wide motte. Construction apparently only took 8 days, though the factual backbone of this claim is disputed. In order for this castle to be built, hundreds of houses would be demolished, and many people were displaced to provide a central urban position, which probably didn't help relations when an uprising against Norman rule in York immediately arose, forcing the castle to be defended by the Sheriff of Yorkshire, a man named William Mallet. The following year the king would order the construction of a second motte and bailey castle in York on Bailey Hill, situated on the west bank of the River Ouse, opposing this site, and the reason was obviously for added security. But the only reason I can think of for having two elevated castles so close together is so you can hurl insults at your neighbour, but then again, I'm immature and certainly not king material. Unfortunately, there wouldn't be enough time for this inevitable insult contest, as that year, 1069, a Danish Viking fleet would sail along the Humber and Ouse to York and assaulted both castles, with the aid of local rebels, an event in which the Normans would set fire to some houses in the city, allegedly spreading all the way to the Minster, and these wooden castles would apparently not be left unscathed. The Danes would capture the castles, and at least partially begin to deconstruct them, but towards the business end of that year and into 1070, William I would embark on a series of military campaigns known as the Harrying of the North in an attempt to quell these uprisings once and for all. Scorched earth tactics would be employed to deprive his enemies of the necessary surplus to fight, particularly in Yorkshire. This allowed him to restore order and rebuild the two castles within the city of York, albeit once again in wood. The bailey at York Castle, here at what's known today as Clifford's Tower, would be expanded. All that remains of the bailey these days though is this grassy patch, at the centre of which stands a tree with a really small sign that cannot be read from a distance. I hope it reads "Please stay off the grass." This area today is known as the Eye of York. Almost 2 decades following the castle's reconstructions, a moat would surround the motte here at York Castle according to the Domesday Book, which was a manuscript record of the Great Survey completed in 1086, listing the holdings and dues owed to the king from more or less every shire in England, and also some portions of Wales. The original document survives almost 1,000 years on, which is not relevant to this video, but I thought it's a cool fact. Also, eventually the castle at Bale Hill would be abandoned in favour of Clifford's, so we can forget about that one. Anyway, into the 12th century, Henry II would visit the castle 4 times during his reign, and would pay for repairs to the keep. The castle would also be utilised as a base in receiving homage from the Scottish King William the Lion, In the 12th century, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, otherwise known as the Knights Templar, would also have connections to this place. A wealthy Western Christian military order, founded in the early 12th century, most famously remembered due to their activities during the Crusades in the Holy Lands. They were leased land upon which stood mills that supported the garrison at York Castle. However, this land was prone to flooding, so constant repairs to these mills were necessary. But towards the end of the 12th century, York Castle would experience perhaps its darkest event. In the year 1190, York became the backdrop to one of the worst anti-Semitic massacres of the Middle Ages. You see, following the Norman conquest of 1066, England began to amass Jewish populations protected by the crown due to their more relaxed religious views on money lending. And since receiving interest was considered usury to Christians, giving out the loans in the first place had no real incentive. William the Conqueror would require lending services to construct the castles and secure their grasp on the land, and so naturally he would turn to Jewish merchants in Rouen, in Normandy, France. Thereafter, Jewish migrants would settle in England, establishing communities in various major settlements, including eventually York. Unfortunately, in a time of religious zeal, coexisting with those of different faiths does tend to come with its complications, and come the latter half of the 12th century there was a growing hostility towards the Jewish population in England, one that in part boiled down to theological disagreements between Christian and Jewish scholars, but also due to stories accusing the Jews of murdering Christian children. This is now known as blood libel. The logic behind the story's plausibility aside, this slander gave strength to a rising anti-Semitic sentiment here in England at the time. Come the coronation of King Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart in 1189, his declared intentions to join the Crusades stoked the fires of anti-Semitic sentiment further, with rumours apparently spreading that he even ordered English Jews to be attacked. The following year, 1190, tensions would boil in York. Following the dawn of the Third Crusade, the Sheriff of York would depart to participate. Across the land in various cities around this time, attacks on Jewish populations was growing increasingly more prevalent. As for the events that were about to unfold in York, it appears as if there are two stories behind why they occurred. One pertains to the recent king's coronation, in which groups of English Jews, though barred from attending, would wait outside the event anyway, only to be set upon by a mob. Two of those attending were citizens from York named Benedict and Josias. Supposedly, Benedict would be killed on his way back to York. A few months later, a fire would break out in the city of York, and amidst the chaos, Benedict's house would be looted and everybody inside was killed. Supposedly, at the heart of the chaos in York stood a man named Richard de Malbis, who owed a sizable debt to a Jewish merchant named Aaron of Lincoln. It's said de Malbis, looking for a means to avoid paying his debt, took advantage of the situation, inciting a mob against the Jewish community in York. The event would force the Jews to seek refuge here at what's known today as Clifford's Tower, where they would lock themselves within the wooden keep with the aid of the constable, who inevitably left the castle to deliberate the situation, but would not be allowed to re-enter, leading to a siege against the keep lasting far too long for the people inside to effectively hold out. A handful of Jews would surrender, promising their conversion to Christianity following a promise of safety for doing so, only to be killed. As for the some 150 people who remained, they would take their own lives rather than surrender their beliefs or allow the mob the satisfaction, and so the men would kill their wives and then their children before ending themselves. They would also set fire to their possessions, leading to a blaze that burned the wooden keep down. The events of 1190 and the senseless deaths of these people are immortalised on the site by a plaque. On the night of Friday, 16th of March 1190, some 150 Jews and Jewesses of York, having sought protection in the royal castle on this site from a mob incited by a bloke named Richard, and others chose to die at each other's hands rather than renounce their faith. Following this event, the wooden keep would be reconstructed again, at an expense of just over £200. A sum that wouldn't even get you 10 hours of driving lessons today, but of course it was a substantial sum for the time. King John would come to use York Castle quite extensively during his tenure, At this time, records would begin to emerge of the castle being used as a jail. Prisoners from John's Irish campaigns would be held here, and by the 13th century, York would become noted as being heavily fortified. Come the reign of Henry III, the wooden keep would be destroyed by harsh weather, but would not undergo a fourth incarnation just yet. Rather, a building designated to the king's use would be established in the Bailey. It was only in 1244 that, under the threat of a Scottish invasion, Henry would order the reconstruction of the keep in white limestone, a project that would take 25 years to complete. With work concluding in the year 1270, Clifford's Tower as we know it today was born, although it wasn't yet known as Clifford's Tower, as firstly it was known as the King's Tower. It stood apart as a peculiar design for a castle keep in England, with speculation suggesting its design was experimental. Its quatrefoil layout did afford a greater view of the ground beneath the motte in the event of an attack, so perhaps it was a symbol of significance. The new stone keep would require constant maintenance. The mott's soil would be damaged by flooding, the keep would subside and the lobes would crack. Despite it being recommended that the stone keep be rebuilt from the ground up in the early 14th century, it was only repaired at a much lesser cost. Its jail would be expanded by King Henry III to hold up to roughly 300 prisoners at any given time, and the responsibility for overseeing this portion of the facility would fall to that of the sheriff. Conditions in the jail here were said to be poor, with those detained frequently dying or attempting to escape, and in 1298 some 28 prisoners successfully made off. Come the dissolution of the Knights Templar in England in the early 14th century, many knights were arrested and some were held here. As for York Castle's significance, it would become the headquarters for the sheriffs. York would also serve as an administration centre during the early 14th century. Due to this political power, York Castle also began to compete with the courts in London. Edward III would also establish a mint here in 1344, producing gold and silver coins for the north of England. In the 15th century, York had truly become an enormous asset regarding security in northern England. However, that doesn't mean it would be brilliantly maintained going forward, with repairs occurring less frequently as time passed. Richard III would acknowledge the problems with Clifford's Tower in 1483, ordering the least repairable structures to be removed. He would, however, die at the Battle of Bosworth and wind up being buried under what would eventually be a car park before any replacement work could be carried out. Regardless, the castle's mint would remain functional until the passing of King Edward VI in 1553. Going forward, the castle would sustain one function, seeing use as a local jail and execution site. Traitors in particular would be hanged from the top of the tower. Even at this point, it was not yet known as Clifford's Tower. That name is believed to come from the Clifford family, otherwise known as the Earls of Cumberland, who claimed to be hereditary constables of the castle. Regardless of whether or not this was the name's origin, the name Clifford's Tower was recorded when a scandal arose accusing the jailer here, Robert Redhead, of taking and selling stone from the site. Come the 17th century, the castle's military functionality was greatly diminished and perhaps even insignificant, especially when compared to its former self. Regardless, York became something of a northern capital during the English Civil War, with forces loyal to Charles I garrisoned both here and in the wider city area. The castle's grounds would be heavily modified to support cannon defences, and the castle's mint would reopen, supplying the army with money. However, following the tides of that conflict on the 14th of July 1644, York would surrender to parliamentarian forces. A few decades later, in April of 1684, Clifford's Tower's interior would be largely destroyed by a fire believed to be the result of firing a ceremonial salute for St. George's Day. It's unclear if it was a fire or an explosion, though it's commonly remembered as the latter. By the end of the 17th century, however, all that stood were the walls, with the upper floors and roof completely gone. The site continued to see use as a prison going into the 18th century, and at this time perhaps their most infamous inmate would have been Richard Turpin, often known as Dick Turpin, a notorious English highwayman whose actions would be greatly romanticised following his execution in Knavesmire, York, 1739. His grave can be found not far from Clifford's Tower today. In the 1830s, the castle's former bailey would undergo redevelopment as a prison following centuries of scandal regarding the castle's suitability for holding prisoners. Those prison buildings today are used as the museum, and at this time the mound and tower would be enclosed and access was only granted to those with magistrate's permission. In the 20th century, repairs would begin to be undertaken with the site entering state guardianship in 1915, and with the closure of York Prison in 1929, eventually, public access to the castle would be granted again, and these days Clifford's Tower is a Grade 1 listed building operated and taken care of by English Heritage, who recently conserved the site further with new internal stairways and viewing platform being added in 2022, along with work done to preserve the stonework itself. I won't pretend there's a lot to see, there's certainly a lot to read and it's well worth a visit, even if only for the views of the top of the tower affords you of the surrounding city. You can also see the car park from up here, so you can helplessly watch on as a delinquent borrows your vehicle with no intent on returning it. In conclusion, Clifford's Tower won't fulfill a day out, but it certainly can operate as part of one. Now that's where the historical discussion sort of ends, I guess, but of course a site such as this cannot avoid sparking legends and rumours over the years, and naturally being a centuries-old monument, it will come with stories of hauntings and the like, especially in York. The most popular story is apparently red bloodstains are said to be visible at times on the walls, believed by many to be linked to the 1190 massacre. Though the story is fanciful, it's believed these stains are caused by iron oxide rust on the stonework. People have also claimed to hear inexplicable knocking noises from the ceilings of rooms, the sounds of footsteps and ghostly figures supposedly both seen and captured in photographs. Were these stories from anywhere else, they'd stand out, but in York they simply serve to blend in. This hugely historical city is said to be home to countless haunted sites. In fact, I'd wager they outweigh the sites that aren't said to be haunted. Now, my stance on the paranormal is one of disbelief for the most part. However, I mention this at the end of this video simply because even if these stories are false, the site still needs to inspire that imagination, and when you view things from that angle, you cannot lose. Either ghosts are real, or these sites are enchanting enough for you to feel understanding for where these stories stemmed from, and to me, this means the story has value either way. York is a fascinating city, well worth a day out, or even and perhaps more ideally, several. There's a lot to see and do here, and Clifford's Tower is but one historical attraction in a sea of many. I enjoy spending time in York as there's always something else to see, and I can certainly understand why it's a bit of a tourist hotspot in the north of England. It's a welcoming place with tons and tons of rich history, myths and legends in vast quantities, boozers, and what more could you possibly want? And that brings us quite nicely to the end of today's video, because it's time to leave. Thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, maybe share this channel with your friends. It would all be massively appreciated. And hopefully we'll be seeing you all very soon with another little adventure at some point. But until that time, please take care and goodbye.